A well-dressed black father and his young daughter are shopping when a racist woman humiliates them in front of the entire store. But the father's calm response leaves everyone speechless, revealing a powerful lesson in dignity, resilience, and rising above hate. The air in the busy department store was thick with the hum of shoppers, the sound of shopping carts rolling down aisles, and the occasional ringing of the register. It was a typical Saturday afternoon with a crowd of people hurrying through their errands, some in casual clothes, others dressed for more upscale purchases. The store was vibrant with color and life as aisles overflowed with products. In the midst of it all, a well-dressed black father moved carefully through the aisles, his small daughter skipping beside him, both selecting items for their family's week ahead. The father was tall and dignified, with a quiet grace that contrasted the busy scene around him. His daughter, perhaps 5 or 6, wore a bright yellow dress and held tightly onto her father's hand, occasionally tugging at him to show her favorite snacks. He smiled at her, guiding her toward the produce section. They were just like any other family, shopping, spending time together, trying to enjoy a simple Saturday outing. However, their peaceful moment was about to be interrupted. A woman, perhaps in her mid-50s, stood nearby, clearly staring. She was dressed in a crisp designer outfit that exuded wealth, with sharp heels and a meticulously styled bob. Her eyes followed the father and daughter as they moved down the aisle, her gaze shifting from them to the products on the shelves. It wasn't long before she made her way toward them, her steps purposeful. To those around her, she seemed to carry an air of superiority, like she felt out of place among the everyday shoppers. And soon, her rude assumptions were about to spill out. The woman's eyes narrowed as she watched the father and his daughter move through the store. Her lips barely parted as she muttered a quiet but judgmental remark to herself, a sneer forming on her face. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, watching them from the corner of her eye. The father, seemingly unaware of her gaze, continued to help his daughter pick out snacks, both of them lost in their own little world. But it was clear, the woman wasn't about to let the moment pass. Her mind churned with assumptions, each more offensive than the last. The father was out of place, she thought, standing in a store like this with his modest appearance. The way he carried himself, calm, kind, and without pretension, seemed to irritate her even more. With a deep breath, the woman stepped forward, closing the space between them. She walked with a briskness that made it impossible for him to ignore her now. "I'm not sure you realize," she began, her tone dripping with condescension, "but people like you don't exactly belong in a store like this." Her voice wasn't loud, but the words hung in the air, sharp and clear. The father paused for a moment, his hand still resting on the cart as he glanced at her, a hint of confusion in his eyes. The woman continued, unfazed. "This is a classy store, not the kind of place you should be shopping in. Maybe you should stick to, well, your own areas. It's not for people like you." Her words were blunt, her expression cold. The nearby shoppers, sensing the tension, began to glance over. Some uncomfortable, others unsure how to react to the cruelty unfolding right in front of them. The woman didn't stop there. Her words grew louder, more venomous, as if she were determined to make her point known to everyone nearby. She leaned in closer to the father, a smirk playing on her lips as she sized him up from head to toe. "I bet you can barely afford half the things in this store," she sneered, gesturing dismissively at the products in his cart. "What, you think just because you've put on a suit, you're somehow one of us now?" The father stayed silent, his face hardening but still calm, trying to shield his daughter from the confrontation. But the woman wasn't done. "Your clothes, what are they? From some cheap outlet store. You don't belong here," she mocked, her voice laced with superiority. She turned to his daughter, who was clinging to her father's side, her small face filled with confusion and hurt. "And you, what kind of example are you setting for your child?" The woman continued, her words biting. "What kind of future does a man like you even offer? Probably nothing, I bet." The father's daughter shifted uncomfortably, her eyes wide with confusion and growing distress as she watched the exchange. The woman's words were cruel and targeted, each one landing with a purpose. She made assumptions about the father's background, questioning his intelligence, his worth, and his place in the world, as if she knew him, or anyone, based on a few shallow observations. Around them, some nearby shoppers began to notice, glancing nervously at one another. A few exchanged uneasy looks, unsure if they should step in or stay out of it. Some couldn't believe what they were hearing, while others shifted awkwardly, unwilling to confront the woman directly. The father's patience was being tested, but his focus remained on his daughter, trying to comfort her with a reassuring touch on her shoulder. The father's grip on the shopping cart tightened, but he kept his breathing steady, trying his best to shield his daughter from the venomous words being thrown their way. His daughter looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching for answers. The woman's words had cut deep, and despite his attempts to remain composed, the father could feel the tension rising within him. Finally, he turned to face the woman. His expression remained calm, but there was a quiet power in his gaze. The father's voice was steady, each word deliberate as he addressed her for the first time. "You think you know who I am, don't you?" he said, his tone low but firm. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know how hard I've worked for everything I have." He stood tall, the weight of his years of struggle and success in every syllable. "I'm a college graduate. I've built my own business from the ground up. I've worked long hours, sacrificed countless nights away from my daughter, all to make sure she has a better future than I did. And that, ma'am, is something you'll never understand." His words were a mirror held up to the woman's assumptions, shattering them in an instant. He paused, allowing the silence to hang in the air before he continued. "What you don't see, what you refuse to see, is your own privilege, your belief that people like me don't belong here, that we're somehow inferior to you. It's a mindset that's outdated, narrow, and full of ignorance." The woman stood there, her mouth agape, but the father's voice never wavered. "You're not just insulting me," he added. "You're insulting every person who's had to fight for what they have, and that's something you'll never be able to take away from me." He turned back to his daughter, offering her a soft, reassuring smile. The father stood there for a moment, his calmness almost unnerving. The woman, still standing with her arms crossed, hadn't fully processed the weight of his words. But then, with a slight shift in his posture, the father added something that would change everything. "I don't think you understand just who you're speaking to," he said, his voice still steady, though now there was a quiet pride in it. "I'm not just some man wandering around the store. I'm an entrepreneur. I own several successful businesses." He paused, letting the words sink in. The woman's confident demeanor faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure, not ready to accept what she was hearing. "I've worked harder than you could imagine," the father continued, his eyes steady on her. "My businesses employ people, create opportunities, and give back to communities. I don't need to explain my success to you, but I will say this: I'm far more successful than you could ever imagine." The woman's face went pale. The smug look that had been plastered on her face slowly faded, replaced by an uncomfortable flush. The realization that the man she had belittled was not only well-educated and successful, but far more accomplished than she ever assumed, left her speechless. He took a deep breath, not out of anger, but to ground himself before speaking again. "Thank you for the lesson, though. You've just shown me the very kind of racism that still exists in this world, and for that, I'm grateful. I'll be sure to teach my daughter how to rise above it." Without another word, he turned to his daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Together, they walked away, leaving the woman stunned in the middle of the aisle, her pride shattered by the truth. The silence that followed was thick with discomfort, as other shoppers watched the father and daughter leave with newfound respect. As the father and daughter walked away, the atmosphere in the store shifted. The nearby shoppers, who had been silent observers just moments before, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some looked at the father with quiet admiration, nodding in support as they acknowledged his strength and grace under pressure. A few people even offered apologies, muttering soft words of encouragement, but the father remained focused on his daughter, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Meanwhile, the racist woman stood frozen, her mind racing as the reality of the situation set in. Her face, once flushed with arrogance, was now red with embarrassment. She had never imagined that the man she had tried to humiliate would turn the situation around with such composure and dignity. Now, standing alone in the aisle, she was left to confront the consequences of her own words. The smug confidence she had entered the store with was completely gone, replaced by a sinking feeling of shame. People around her whispered and stared, their eyes filled with disbelief and judgment. No one spoke to her. Instead, they continued to glance at her with quiet disdain. The father and daughter made their way to the exit, their steps steady and purposeful. The daughter, still clutching her father's hand, looked up at him with wide eyes filled with admiration. She had witnessed something powerful, something that would stay with her forever. As they stepped out into the bright sunlight, the father smiled down at her, grateful for the chance to show her not just how to handle adversity, but how to do so with dignity and strength. The world might be full of hate, but they would face it together, unshaken. As the father and daughter made their way toward the store's exit, a quiet shift occurred in the atmosphere. Shoppers who had been silent spectators up until that point began to murmur amongst themselves. Some offered soft apologies, others simply nodded in silent respect. One woman, who had been near the back of the aisle, walked up to the father and gave him a quiet, sincere apology for the way he had been treated. The father smiled politely, accepting it with grace, but never pausing his stride. He had already won the battle, not with words, but with dignity. Meanwhile, the racist woman stood frozen in the aisle, her face flushed with humiliation. Her gaze dropped to the ground, her earlier air of superiority completely gone. The store, once a symbol of her high status, now seemed to mirror her own insignificance in the face of real character and integrity. She could feel the stares of the other shoppers, their judgment weighing heavily on her. But her thoughts were scattered, her mind replaying the father's words over and over again. The father, with his daughter still holding his hand, continued walking. As they reached the door, he bent down slightly to meet her gaze. "You saw what just happened, sweetheart," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Sometimes people will try to tear you down with their ignorance, but the most important thing is how you respond." His daughter looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with admiration. "You didn't yell at her, Dad. You stayed calm." He smiled warmly. Because staying composed in the face of hate shows strength, not weakness. Remember, no matter what, we never lose our dignity. As they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, the father and daughter walked proudly, united by their respect for themselves and the quiet power of standing tall in the face of adversity.